This is Amend and Progress, your go-to podcast from Vidori for all things promotional material review. Get ready for actionable insights, valuable perspectives, and best practices to elevate your workflow and team morale.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Amend and Progress, Vidori's podcast about the material review process. I'm your host, Annalise, and today we're going to be talking about content downstream. So after review and approval, where is your content going? How to maintain compliance of that content, how to govern it, and even how to understand and be really strategic about the effectiveness of that content. Joining me in the conversation today is Noah Welhouse, Global Account Manager at Showpad. Welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Could you quickly just introduce yourself, tell the folks at home a little bit about who you are and what you do, please?
Yeah. My name is Noah Welhouse. I am a global account manager at Showpad. Showpad is a revenue enablement tool. It's where your sellers go to find the content that has been approved and send to whomever they may be sending it to. Been working at Showpad 7 years. Been working in this industry little longer than that. And yeah, been living in Los Angeles last 3 years. Yeah. I think that's it. That's me.
That works. And I'm being in the Midwest, I'm sure your weather is a little bit nicer than mine today. So yet
Yeah.
another score for California, you know?
I used to live in the Midwest, grew up there. So I put in my time after the polar vortex. I was like, nah, I think I'm good.
I love referencing it as you put in your time. You paid your dues, and
Oh.
now we've moved on.
Mhm.
Love to hear it. Well, no, I'm super excited to get in the conversation today, and we'll sort of tee this up, but there's a ton for us to sort of dig into today, and really excited to get your perspective. But as you know, I like to start the conversation with some easy, hopefully quick fire questions just to get to know you a bit better. So, are you up for it?
Yeah, please.
All right, first question. What is your signature dish or recipe?
I don't think I have a signature dish. I do love to cook. I have a garden, love farmers markets. But if I had to pick one, I'd say like chicken thigh tacos. Probably my
Ooh,
go-to.
okay. Any particular preparation or just kind of like depending on the ingredient? You sound like an ingredient forward person. What's in
Yeah,
season? Is that
yeah.
sort of what's driving the recipe?
Yes, I'm obnoxious about my food preferences, but no, I would say chicken thighs, marinated, garlic, some vinegar, olive oil, cumin, paprika, let that marinate, quick sear, take it off before it's cooked, rest, chop it up, finish it in the fond. Yeah, simple, right? And then whatever sauces are in season.
I love it. That sounds fantastic. It's about lunchtime here, so that's making me incredibly hungry. Second question, what's one either productivity hack, best practice thing you do in your daily life?
I would say nothing earth-shattering. For me, like many people I know, my attention span is so minimal. And messaging and emails and your phone is built to be like anytime anything comes through, like hey, this is my attention. So I schedule out the entirety of my day, like especially for things that I need to get done but don't have a deadline, like prospecting, checking into, earnings reports, those type of things. I just schedule blocks and I'm like, okay, my phone's over there. People can get a hold of me later.
Mhm.
Again, nothing earth-shattering, but it's how I need to segment up my day.
No, I mean, earth-shattering, who has an earth-shattering thing at this point? I think it's just interesting to hear given the like influx of productivity, content out there, like what's actually helpful. So I think the time blocking thing is perfectly suited, well suited for the response to the question. So I think that's great.
Great. Glad to help.
Okay, perfect. All right, so let's get to the conversation today. So, like I said, really excited to sort of get your perspective, just given how you're working with life science companies
Yeah.
downstream, right? Once the content's reviewed and approved. And I was sort of reflecting on this conversation as we were coming into the interview today. And, Vidori just released our annual benchmarks report.
Mhm.
Part of the benchmarks report, we survey customers and ask them, what are your challenges today and what are your anticipated challenges next year? Maybe not surprising, content
Yeah.
is challenging, right? And there's a multitude of reasons why that's coming up. Resource constraints, I think there's a lot of pressure to create new creative content, stay on top of the trends and best practices. The algorithms are changing, video, websites. Like, I think there's just a lot
Yeah.
of pressure and expectation around the types of content these companies need to be creating. However, sometimes they're really resource constrained. And then there's sort of the effectiveness piece of
Yes.
content's expensive to create. Let's just like say that out loud. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. And if it's not getting used, or you don't know if it's getting used, or you're not sure how it's getting used, it's really hard to then pivot your strategy or adapt for things. And so, perfect timing, I think, for this conversation heading into a new year for companies to get sort of your perspective on this and some best practices as they start to think about content next year. And so, sort of my spiel aside, I'm curious from your perspective, what are like some trends or observations you're seeing like within life science content in 2024? And then what are you anticipating to see next year in 2025?
So I think it's important to set the framework of companies that I work with. So my role as a global account manager is I work with our larger existing companies. So these are strategic companies. They're Fortune 200 life sciences companies. So they're larger. I would say one of the big trends, and I don't think it's going anywhere, acquisitions, right? Acquiring companies. Where I think I'm seeing change is obviously every acquisition is its own beast. Um, but trying to figure out very quickly, where does this sit in the organization? Is this something that's going to be standalone? Is this something that our current sellers are going to be cross-selling? How we figure that out, I would say historically that's had a little bit longer of a life cycle of like how do we bring them into the fold. Now it's much more coming in with a plan. How do we move forward there? So I think that's something I'm seeing in that timeline from acquisition to kind of bringing into core offerings has definitely shrunk, right? How much
Hmm.
value are you getting out of that acquisition and how quickly? The other two big ones. I would say like sellers have so little time to actually pitch in this industry, right? Like I think some of the research I did, it was like less than 5 minutes on average. So you need things that are easily findable, engaging, and like can grab somebody's attention when you're passing them in a hallway or just, hey, can I talk to you quick, right? So having something that is engaging and being able to get those metrics of what's happening when you're in front of somebody. This is something like from life sciences, kind of started in the pharma industry a long time ago under the term detailing, like, hey, when I'm presenting to
Hmm.
them, what is their sentiment? How are they feeling about it? And today, a lot of those activities are tracked at the end of the day, where it's like, hey, what worked? What didn't? And I'm a seller. If I don't do it in the moment, I'm never going to remember to do it at the end of the day. And what I'm putting into the system of what I kind of maybe remember or just want to check something off my list is probably not very indicative of reality. So I think that companies that I'm working with are definitely giving sellers more of a so what, automating things to make it easier, making more engaging content, and saying like, hey, if you do log this, this is what we're going to give you in return, right? Here's the
Hmm.
campaign that this is going to attach to. Here, you're going to know what's working, what's not. What did I actually talk about? What are people looking at? So I think the content is one thing, but the workflow and the regiment around what content is working in the moment is becoming a lot tighter.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think you're bringing up really important process aspects
Oh, yeah.
that, of course, feed into governance, compliance, effectiveness. Are there certain metrics you think in today's world are better captured or better representative of content effectiveness? Like, what are companies looking at today from your perspective that are actually helpful and saying, yes, this is working, or I think we need to maybe pivot
Yeah.
strategy here?
So I think like over the last couple years, compliance and making that regimented has been the focus. it's not easy to do. And I think a lot of companies were like, okay, we need to fit this governance around 100% of our organization right away in one go. And that's almost impossible to do, right? Like you have to manage to the majority of people and then figure out the fringe cases. You're never going to get it all in one bite. In terms of metrics, I think the surprisingly most overlooked one is unused content. It's very easy to see what content is resonating with your customers and your sellers most, right? Like what content is working the best. But what people don't look at, especially from a marketing perspective, is like what's not working? What are we spending money on and putting out there that's not resonating with anybody? And a big part of my job is going in and saying like, hey, I know your sellers are telling you, I'm sure your listeners, like they've heard this, sellers saying, I can't find what I'm looking for. I can't find this. And so it is the idea that the more content we have, the more effective it will be. The less I will hear that. But that's not the case. Like in working with a lot of my customers, to give a specific example, working with a customer, they recently cut 30% of their content. And like this was a huge program. The marketing teams were like, "Hey, like I want to hold on to this like just in case, right?"
Hmm.
What they found was they cut 30% of their content. Most of it had been used zero times in the last 180 days.
Sure.
And they found that their sellers were actually looking at more content. I think 25% more content than they had previously. And more importantly, the prospects or customers were looking at it double. They were looking at what was sent to them double what they had before. And this wasn't just a one-time spike. This is like a big hit right away and then sustained. So that was a very long answer to your succinct question, but I would say like the most important one is what is not being used, what is not working.
Well, and I think you're providing a case study for creating less content,
Yeah,
right? There is something to be said about creating less, really testing that out, really
yeah.
understanding what the reaction is, and then if we need to revise it, pull it back, do something new. I think there's always maybe this tendency to create as like the default for whatever reason. But as we think about things like resource constraints, or you're not really knowing what's working, more is not necessarily more. Would you
And
agree?
I do agree. And to go back to your previous point, I think that a big part of this is coming out of the compliance, especially in life science. It is such a long process to get
Mhm.
something done that you want to hold on to it and not pull it out or measure what's actually working. So, like, once it's in a system, once it's exposed to sales, it's like, okay, we're done, right? Like, we did the compliance thing. And I would say that for a lot of players, that is changing and they're spending less money on better content because of that. But it's a hard process. It's not easy.
Yeah. Well, you bring up such a great point. Everyone spent so much time reviewing and approving it. The hope is that it's getting used because you want to validate that
Yeah.
time. So it's a completely understandable perspective, but at the end of the day, if that's not working, we
Yeah.
need to sort of change the strategy. I wanted to also go back. So you talked a little bit about discoverability of content.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about this a little bit because we say it in broad strokes all the time. Deliver the content to the right audience at the right time, make it findable. But I don't know that that's always the experience of the person consuming the content.
Yeah.
How do you make content discoverable and really truly serve it up to your sellers and the people in the field at the right time? What are some things that companies can think about to make this a little bit better for that sort of like end consumer audience?
So I think to go to the highest level, in speaking with many customers, it is trying to figure out what your sales process is. Talk to your sellers about how they sell. I think there's a big disconnect between marketers and subject matter experts creating content and sellers when they're in front of somebody, right? Like to give you a specific example, when I talk to marketers, I say like, hey, what can your sellers sell of your offerings? And they say, well, they can sell everything. And then you talk to the sellers and they're like, well, I only sell 10% of this. So like by saying, hey, you can sell everything, but not segmenting those sellers in any way, you're making stuff harder to find. So I think making things that are available in bite size, like, hey, they could sell this, but it's probably a fringe case or it's reduced. That's probably going to be lesser importance and not going to need to be found as often as the
Mm,
things that are the core to their job. So I think defining what your sellers sell, how they sell, and like what you want to move them to is the biggest piece, and like talking to them. There's so many conversations that I have that I say like, "Hey, how do your sellers sell?" They're like, "I have no idea." Like, what? So I think that that would be the most important. And then I think auditing. What is working? I think that there is a very good structure for top of funnel collateral, like blasts, like, hey, X% of this is working. We A/B test. But once it's in a seller's hand, I kind of feel like today there's less rigor around what is working and what is not. Either people don't have the ability to measure that, don't have a history of measuring that, or feel like they already should be measuring that and not doing it, and they're kind of afraid to ask.
mhm.
Um, yeah, does does that answer your question?
Absolutely. And I love the examples you're giving because I think it's just illuminating like the specifics around some of this that obviously is part of the customer's day to day. I'm really so content effectiveness. We've sort of been talking a little bit about this. And actually when you before you and I hit record today, you had mentioned something to me that I like really wanted to get some recording of you around in terms of you mentioned to me content compliance is not the same as content effectiveness. Can you speak to that a little bit and just share a little bit more about that perspective because I think it's so important to capture.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of metrics in an organization around content compliance, right? You can only have some amount of content in the system. You need to lock down what your sellers can say. There is a structure for compliance. There is a machine around what compliance looks like, and there is a specific outline, right? Like X amount of days, we have to recycle it or expire it or review it, right? Effectiveness has less of a machine around it, has less history of being measured, right? And that is changing, and the people that are best at it are looking at it from many different perspectives, right? Like, what are their sellers actually viewing? How much are they viewing it? At what stage in the selling cycle are they viewing it? Like, all of this data lives out there, or if you work in other tools, I'm biased. I think Showpad is very great, but there are tools out there that can measure these things, and you need to look at them and have the same level of rigor that you do around compliance, right? Hey, quarterly checks. Uh, where do we need to view this? Like having that structure, building that into your ecosystem for content, and then tying it back to the ROI, right? Like how much content is viewed in a vacuum, who cares, right? Like that's a great data point, but if it's not resulting in sales, if it's not moving people to that next step, it's great that people viewed it and they looked at it, but like it's still not working, right? So I think that that ecosystem is getting much stronger in the life cycle, in the life sciences space, excuse me. Um, but it's still a work in progress for many companies. And there's a lot of people that don't have it built and feel like they should, or don't really have an idea of how to get there, right?
Mhm. It's hard.
Yeah, it's really hard. And I think that for day-to-day people, right, it feels like another thing that they have to do. But I would argue this is the core of your job, right? Like, is this working or is this not? Creating the content is also hard, but that's just the first step. It's like, what is actually working is the most important piece. And I would say from an implementation standpoint, iterate. I hate this phrase, but I use it all the time. Crawl, walk, run. Like, what are you trying to get to? What would be like iterable steps to get there? And then how do you prove it in one piece and then grow it out, right?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think those baby steps, those milestones, this isn't something that you turn on overnight. This is a process and it's iterative to your point. So it might look different next year than it does that. So I think it's just a really excellent point to bring up and sort of talk about that general ecosystem and thinking about those two things in parallel with one another, because of course they're both important. You said ROI. You perfectly teed up my next question. So again, we've been sort of circling around this, but I mean, I'm a marketer. I'm asked to prove
Yeah.
the ROI of content all the time, and it's incredibly difficult. Of course, you can look at certain metrics and is it being used, what's not being used, but are you getting questions around ROI of content? And what is sort of, how would you guide companies to think about this in today's world, given the various tools and technology that's out there? But, what's your sort of your perspective on content ROI and how to make the case that certain content is working, apart maybe from use alone?
Yeah. And again, I think use alone is bare table stakes. If you as an organization are only looking at that as your measure of success, that's not enough. And your competitors are doing more, right? One, I would say this is such a generic answer, but like measure success as many ways as you can, right? Measure success as many ways as you can. There's so much data out there, but I think that can be paralyzing. So I think to framework yourself, identify what are the most important things for you in your organization. Like, what are you caring about this year and next year? Top line, bottom line, right? Are we looking to expand our average deal size? Are we doing that through cross-selling? Are we looking to shorten our deal cycle, right? All of these things dictate what you measure and when. To give you a specific example, hey, we acquired a new company, or we are having a product launch. If we launch this product, how many new opportunities are being created? How quickly are they moving through the sales cycle? Is it getting hung up at one stage or another? So the content and its usage in and of itself is great, but until you tie that back to your CRM, quota attainment, moving through sales velocity, all of those things, it doesn't matter, right? Like it's good to know, it's nice to know people are viewing it, but until you tie it back to real world activities, you're not getting the good stuff, right? Like that's really the gold standard is tying that whole thing together into a view that at least most of the people in your organization can view on this is what is important to us.
Mhm. I love it. What a great way to end the conversation today. No, thank you so much. I've benefited so much from this conversation as well. So thank you for just sharing your insights and perspectives. I just think as folks are heading into the new year, this is just going to be incredibly top of mind and incredibly helpful. So appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And folks, the conversation doesn't stop here. Follow Vidori on LinkedIn for updates on new episodes. Ask us questions. We'd love to get your feedback on any of the Amend and Progress episodes to date. You can subscribe to Amend and Progress on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, this is Annalise signing off for Amend and Progress. Have a fantastic day.